Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in Shelley Sokolowski's weaving class. I'm Annan Barrett, and I teach in the Textile Arts program at Portland State. For those of you joining us from outside the university, the Textile Arts curriculum is part of the BFA Art Practice program that provides an interdisciplinary approach to the study of clothing and textiles. This is one of several free public events we are hosting this term, where we bring in outside perspectives to supplement our current course offerings. Please see psutextilearts.com for information about our upcoming events. We'll be using the chat to take questions tonight. Feel free to type your inquiries there in the chat as we go, and Shelley and I will make sure they are addressed at the end of Kate's talk. I'm going to hand it over to Shelley now, who will present the land acknowledgement and introduce us to Kate.
Yes, I hope I'm unmuted. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge we are joining you all from Portland State University, which is located near the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon in Multnomah County. We honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Today, we are so thrilled. I am so thrilled, and I know we all are, to welcome Kate Nartker, who works between animation and weaving to dismantle images, narratives, and material structures. Kate received an MFA from the California College of the Arts and is an assistant professor of textile design at the Wilson College of Textiles at North Carolina State University. Her work has been included in exhibitions throughout the United States and internationally, including the Museum of Craft and Design in San Francisco, the Contemporary Austin, and the Hordaland Art Center in Bergen, Norway. She was named a 2023 Fulbright U.S. Scholar, and her writing has been published in the Journal of Textile Design Research and Practice, Textile, Cloth and Culture, and the Surface Design Journal. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so delighted that you're with us.
Thank you so much. Should I go ahead and share my screen? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let me see. Okay, can you all see it? Okay. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to present my work, and I'm also just excited to be part of this incredible speaker series. So thank you so much to Anna and Shelley and Allison for the invitation. Okay, so tonight I'll be talking mostly about my studio practice, which again involves the use of animation and weaving. But before I talk about my own work, I wanted to begin with the broader context of my research, which is centered on this intersection of cinema and textiles. So this is kind of a two-part presentation where first I will talk about this broader research, and then I will begin talking about my studio practice and how these ideas have informed my own work. Okay, so when textiles are discussed in the context of cinema, the focus is often placed on the role that textiles play in the production of film, whether that's set design or costume design, or even the depiction of textiles to shape meaning throughout a film. And pictured here are screenshots of different films that have been highlighted as examples where textiles are a prominent feature in the storyline or in their set designs. But in each of these examples, textiles are simply used as a tool to support filmic storytelling. And I think there's a much more complex interplay between these two mediums, and we see evidence of that when we look at the work of historical and contemporary artists and filmmakers. So there's 5 areas that I'm interested in terms of following how these two fields shape one another. And this includes narrative, form, material, labor, and theory. So I will touch just very briefly on each of these topics, mainly as a way of kind of laying the groundwork for my own studio practice. And I also hope to show that the value found in locating connections between these disparate fields is that this has been a generative source in expanding creative practices. And I also hope to demonstrate the contributions that craft practices can bring to the field of film and in giving us new ways to approach moving images. So, of course, there is so much that can be said about textiles and storytelling, but I wanted to begin by looking at some early textiles, as these are the few examples that have been referenced as a direct influence of cinema. And perhaps no textile artifact has been compared to cinema as much as the Bayeux tapestry. Pictured here is the Bayeux tapestry, which is a 230-foot long embroidered cloth that depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England. And it was created in the 11th century. There's been interest among film historians and film theorists in studying the Bayeux tapestry as an early filmic record and as one of the most elaborate pictorial origins of narrative cinema. Film theorist Gerald Noxon said, almost all of the pictorial and narrative techniques and devices found in common forms of cinema drama today have their equivalents in the Bayeux tapestry. And the techniques that he's referring to are these very specific technical devices that we see all the time in film. And this includes flashbacks, flash forwards, the depiction of interior monologues. And it's even been found throughout the tapestry, a cross-dissolve transition, or this sort of slow fading from one scene to the next. Other examples of early narrative textiles include the Tristan quilt, which is one of the earliest surviving quilts dating back to the 14th century. And Indian tapestries dating back to the 3rd century tell elaborate stories, and these were intended for a mass audience, moving from place to place by performers who used them as narrative aids. And pre-Columbian textiles, such as this Chimu tapestry shirt and weaving, these were considered stories that can be carried, and they were theatrical, dramatic narratives that relied on the use of repetition and sequence to depict legends. And Palestinian Tatriz embroidery documents stories through patterns and motifs that symbolize different regions and personal histories. So similar to the Bayeux tapestry, there's a narrative that can be followed throughout each of these textiles. There's also a figuring of narrative space. Like continuity editing, there's a flow of images and patterns as stories unfold. But unlike a film, the images move in all directions, so we have the potential to scan the past and the future while also viewing the present. In many cases, these early textiles were larger than life and embodied the cinematic, not just in the way they told stories, but in aesthetic and experiential qualities. There's an article called Reflections on Fabric and Meaning by Arthur Danto, where he discusses Raphael's tapestries that hung in the Sistine Chapel. And he talks about how the cloth achieved cinematic visual effects. With the light and the drafts of wind, there was this moment-to-moment interaction that gave a motility to the woven images. And so all of these early examples have led to discussions on the potential that textiles have not only been used historically to tell stories, but they may have played a role in contributing to the advent of moving pictures. Beyond the narrative function of early textiles, there are structural features in textile practices that intersect with the processes of traditional filmmaking. And one could say that film strips even resemble certain fabrics, such as these kente cloths. And perhaps it is no surprise, given that weavers and filmmakers are in a way working within similar constraints. The weaver is limited to the width of the loom, while the filmmaker must capture footage within the frame. The duration of each is essentially unlimited, so both processes result in vertical material forms that serve as a sequential record of time. In her book, Design in Motion, Laura Fromm argues that these aesthetic links speak to a larger philosophical connection between film and design at the Bauhaus. Through a range of examples, she demonstrates how film impacted the Bauhaus's notion of form creation and initiated this shift toward a new idea of form as something that's flexible and process-based. Between 1919 and 1933, film began to influence the Bauhaus workshops, and students and faculty began creating these abstract animations, experimented with film strips, light plays, architectural films, and they also invited a number of avant-garde filmmakers to present their work. And so Fromm discusses how this, what she calls this encounter with film, how it fell on fertile ground where students pushed the idea of film into new material aesthetic and philosophical frameworks. So in the context of weaving, weavers at the Bauhaus embraced this geometric form language where we can see these square shapes and ribbons and stripes that resemble film strips. And there's also this sort of intermittent, rhythmic, repetitive, and motion-based aesthetic. And so Fromm traces this to a new way of thinking about processes, operations, and sequences. One quote, she says, this emphasis on weaving as a processual practice brought to light how weaving can be conceived as a temporal medium based on the creation of modular patterns that unfold in time, just as an abstract film or film scroll rendered visible the evolving play of modular forms in motion. In the late 70s, many experimental filmmakers, of course, moved away from film and began to work with VHS. Video artist Beryl Cora explored weaving and video as related technologies. And Cora is an early video art pioneer, and in this excerpt, she's talking about her piece entitled Text and Commentary from 1977.
So that on the loom, you build up pattern line by line, and the pattern itself has a numerical basis to it. We all know that we decode information on a page, line by line. And the video had, I guess it was a video gun that sprayed electrons in terms of lines at the surface of the video screen. So that was enormously interesting to me, that the information on the video screen was actually embedded in lines. So I just became really interested in how lines could be built up to create information, how a narrative could be put together based on weaving structures.
So the structural connection that Cora is referencing is the grid-like foundation of the two mediums. VHS is made up of static vertical lines with information running through horizontally, just like a weaving. And so because of the interlacing lines, sometimes the glitched patterns that can surface on the screen from VHS tapes share a striking resemblance that resembles certain weaving patterns. So in these two examples, on the left-hand side are screenshots of VHS noise, and on the right are weaving drafts or weaving patterns that resemble those same undulating patterns. There are a number of examples where artists and filmmakers are expanding film practice by working with celluloid and the materials of filmmaking in new ways. In 1973, filmmaker Annabelle Nicholson did a performance entitled Real Time, where she ran film through a sewing machine and then back into a projector. And there was another projector behind her, which cast her shadow onto a screen. And Annabelle Nicholson was a filmmaker in the structural materialist film movement of the 1960s and 70s. And in this movement, artists attempted to be non-illusionist, and they worked toward an increased materialism as a way to demystify or dismantle the illusion of cinema. So in a way, it makes sense that a filmmaker in this movement might turn to the material practices and tools, such as those involved with sewing. Regarding her performance, Nicholson said that she wanted to hold the film in her hand. She said, "I could respond to the material. It was in my hands, not the camera." And contemporary artists Sabrina Gishwander on the left and Jennifer West on the right both coincidentally have bodies of work that they each refer to as film quilts, excuse me. Gishwander splices and stitches together fragments of footage and then cuts and sews it into traditional quilt patterns. In West's work on the right, in many of these pieces, the film itself is sort of treated like cloth. There's panels of hand-dyed blank film, hand-printed film, or film strips that have been bleached or splattered and dripped with dyes. And so her work really it alludes to this relationship between sewing and film, but it also underscores the responsive nature of the material. And so by applying surface design techniques that are rooted in textile practices, we can see that film is not only a material that can be used to capture imagery, but it can also absorb it, resulting in these expansive abstract visual effects. And now turning to the fourth connection, which is labor. In the 1900s, the cutting rooms of early cinema were staffed predominantly with women. And this was work that was seen as menial, and women's skills were, with sewing, were thought to be easily transferable to work in the cutting room. And film historians have referenced shots as being just strung together, implying that little skill or creativity was involved in the work. In describing the cutting rooms of the early 1900s, Walter Murch said, "In those manual pre-mechanical days, the cutting room was a relatively tranquil tailor shop in which time was cloth." In describing the editor, he went on to say, she projected the assembly with the director and the producer and took notes and returned to her room to make further adjustments, shortening this, lengthening that, like a second fitting of a shirt. This new version was projected in turn, and the cycle was repeated over and over until the fit was as perfect as she could make it. Even though women in the cutting rooms played a critical role in creating films, their work was under-recognized and uncredited, and this also was the case in avant-garde cinema. These are stills from a 1925 film by Walter Ruttmann entitled Opus 4, and the Bauhaus weaver Lori Ludesdorff has written about her experiences in drawing and coloring entire sequences for this film. Just as we see with many of the Bauhaus weavings, this film explores modular and geometric forms and lines and this interplay of colors through rhythm and movement. So on the left are Bauhaus weaving designs, and you can certainly locate these aesthetic links between those designs and the film on the right. And Fromm discusses this example in her book, and she states that this is just one of many examples that illustrates how closely intertwined women's work is with the history of cinema. And this was possible because these women embraced a fluid way of working across creative modes of expression. And I think it would be interesting in further research to really identify what haptic knowledge and what material knowledge these women brought to the table, and what are the ways that they influence the stylistic dimension of these avant-garde films, as well as major motion pictures. And then finally, turning to theory. So far I have been kind of pulling all of these different examples and materials and concepts into a textile discourse, but I think it can be argued that textile practices also have the potential to serve as a conceptual framework to interpret film. Film theorist Laura Marks offers a theory that she calls haptic visuality. And she describes this as a way of looking when the eye itself operates as an organ of touch. And it's a form of film criticism that offers an embodied way of engaging with moving images to privilege surface and textures rather than depth and narrative. And this form of viewership has been used as a feminist strategy to refuse the limits of narrative legibility and to draw alternative meanings from the textural and material qualities found in film. And so throughout her writings on the haptic visuality, Marks doesn't explicitly state a connection to textiles, but she uses many terms from textile techniques and practices to cultivate this form of viewership. So for example, she will talk about the ways that a film pulls or drapes or stretches, rips, and folds. And then one final note is that the term haptic was first introduced by Alois Riegel in the late 1800s. Riegel was an art historian and a curator of textiles at the Museum of Art and Industry in Vienna, and he differentiated haptic visuality from optical vision, explaining that in optical vision, when you are looking at, say, a Renaissance painting, everything is arranged for the viewer, and the focus is on content, depth, and form. And the viewer's position is sort of strengthened by this optical composition, and they have this sort of mastery over the scene. And this is in contrast to haptic visuality when you are looking at, say, a Persian rug, and there's really no special place for the viewer to stand, and there's no entry point. It's almost like the viewer isn't there. There's like a refusal to enter the scene. So instead, the viewer meanders their way around the surface. And so it really was this dismantling of this hierarchical relationship between the viewer and object, which was initially drawn from textiles, that Laura Marks has built her theory on. Okay, so now turning to my own work, thanks so much for staying with me. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I wanted to sort of just lay the foundation for my own studio practice, and I'll point out a little bit how some of these ideas have expanded my own work throughout the years. But as I mentioned, most of my work involves the use of animation and weaving. And I wanted to start with this older animation from 2012 because it's one of the longer animations I made, and it still continues, it carries some themes and ideas that I continue to think about today. So the full animation is 2.5 minutes, but these are just shorter looped excerpts. Okay, so this is the cloth that I wove to create the animation. It's 28 inches wide and 40 feet long, and I wove it on the TC1 before the TC2 came out. And if there's any non-weavers joining us tonight, I should just explain that jacquard weaving is different than weaving on a traditional floor loom because each individual thread can be lifted, which enables more complex imagery to be woven that isn't confined to a repeat. And so this animation, I think it took me about 6 months to weave, and the term line by line is sort of drawing a connection between the production of woven cloth and as well as the movement of the parade. But I thought I would kind of talk about how I create the weaving, the animations. So this is a footage that my father shot that is included in that film. So I start out with a moving image, and then I render out a sequence of sequential JPEGs, and I generally work at 6 frames per second. And then I arrange those images into a grid and apply weave structures to the gridded image, just as you would with any other image that you wanted to weave on a jacquard loom. And you can see a detail here. This was woven with just shaded satin, single wept shaded satins. And then I weave the gridded image, and then I scan it, the fabric, into digital format, and then I animate it frame by frame. And so it really is this process of working back and forth between hand and digital tools. And you know, anybody who's worked with the TC2 knows that there's so much adjustments anyways that you have to do with files and everything. And then I have the added step of taking the cloth and then, you know, scanning it in and working with it digitally to create the animation. But one of the things that I love about weaving is that an image or pattern is created through a structural system rather than resting on the surface. And so I often try to find ways to abstract an image by its own physical makeup so that the material itself becomes this armature of abstraction. In this animation and in several other of my animations, there's this sort of tension between the image and its underlying support. So when the image falls apart and the thread becomes a pattern, the material sort of overrides the picture that it's representing. And I've been interested in how this relates to the way events are abstracted through time, materially and symbolically. The woven cloth for this animation, you can kind of see here that it resembles a physical, tangible zoom or focus. And I have been thinking about how I can use the loom as a camera and how cinematic techniques can be materialized and expressed through cloth. So simple cinematic devices like focus or framing or fading from one scene to the next. I'm curious how I can work these things out physically through weaving. So you can see in this example, the image comes into focus not through a digital device, but just through the act of having more details in the woven fabric itself. This is a piece that I created last year entitled Pattern Practice. And in this work, I was thinking mostly about transitions and how to transition from one pattern to the next. I also created this before I spent last spring in Sweden. And so a lot of these weave structures and patterns are Swedish, just different Swedish designs that I wanted to kind of explore before going. This one is Swedish lace. And so I'll point out one transition in that film, and this is kind of technical, but in weaving, we have this technique, of course, called double weave, which is when you weave two layers at the same time. And you have the opportunity to shift the position of those layers and bring the bottom layer up to the surface. So I was thinking about this idea of cross dissolve or bringing one scene into focus while the other one recedes into the background. And I wanted to do that through double weave or to have these two layers kind of shift position. So in one of the transitions, these were the two scenes or patterns that I was thinking of. And then I created a gradual shift from the blue layer on top to the orange layer on top so that it was sort of this dissolving into a new pattern over time. And of course, with anything related to animation, you work so long. The result is 3 seconds. But theoretically, I was very excited about this idea, and I'll show you in a little bit how I've used it in other projects. When I went to Sweden, I taught a workshop on their TC2 loom at a school called HDK Valand, and I also had a chance just to weave on my own in their weaving workshops. And one of the things that I fell in love with there was just the materials that they had. They mostly ordered just white materials, and the students dyed all of the yarns themselves, and they had so much wool. And so I just started to experiment with a lot of mohair and different wools. And this is a small series that I created when I was in Sweden. And with each of these pieces, I took it once they were off the loom, I brushed them out to get this fuzzy effect. And then I recently made this animation called Self-Care. And I would say I think this is probably what I'm most excited about. I'm working on a longer project right now, but I'm looking forward to coming back to this piece and building on it. And this is the weaving that I created to make that animation. It's very heavy and dense. So in my work, I also think about this idea of haptic viewership, or this, I guess more so the idea of kind of understanding things through touch. So this was an exhibition I had in 2019 called Scratch the Surface, where all of the work really centered on this idea of navigating things through touch, rather than a rational distance. And this is an animation that I had in the show. So the title to this piece is Horse Emotion, and it's a nod to Edward Muybridge's early motion study, Horse in Motion. And here's an image of Muybridge's cabinet cards for Horse in Motion from 1878. And this is regarded as being one of the first examples to record successive phases of motion through photography. And so like Muybridge's work, I used moving images to investigate perception and time, but instead of focusing on motion alone, the emphasis of my piece is really on the texture, tension, and surface of this encounter with a horse. So when I look back at some of my earliest work, when I was just starting to work with textiles, I can see that I was always interested in this cinematic potential of cloth through the use of digital tools. This is a test I did when I was first learning shibori dyeing. I took a workshop at the Penland School of Crafts. I think this was in 2010. And so the fabric that corresponds to this piece is about 4 feet long and maybe 1 feet wide. And it's just a grid of squares that are all slightly different. And so I scanned it into digital format and then created these different digital layers and sort of shifted the opacity of each layers. And so I don't think I really had a language for what I was doing at the time, but I was interested in kind of seeing textiles move in a new way, or I wanted to kind of create something that spoke to the process rather than a final finished piece. Or, you know, maybe it was like this idea of something becoming something else. And I've also, this was the first series of animations I think I made in grad school. These were all hand quilted and very much inspired by the Tristan quilt that I showed earlier. They're all done with the trapunto quilting technique, where you, after quilting the imagery, you go back and stuff batting in certain spaces to achieve this sort of relief effect. But this was very, very time consuming, and I didn't stick with this process for very long. And then going back even earlier, before grad school, I completed this program at a technical school in San Francisco called Apparel Arts, which is a pattern drafting certificate program. And when I look at the work there, along with, I took a weaving class at San Francisco State, but at this time, I can see that, you know, there was this idea of sequence, or, you know, all of the work was kind of falling apart or coming together. So I'd like to bring this up with students just because I think it's really important to explore these ideas that you may not have a language for, and that you know, just really trusting that these vague, nascent impulses can be the beginning stages of a much larger conceptual inquiry. And then I wanted to show a few examples of how I have displayed my work in different ways. Sometimes I show the work with fabric, and sometimes I show the animation on its own or the fabric on its own. This is an image from an exhibition I was in that was curated by the Oregon-based curator Ashley Stollmeyers, and this exhibition was at Alabama Contemporary, entitled "If You Have Ghosts." And I've also had a chance to show my work in different public spaces. This was a film festival in San Francisco. This was at the Indianapolis International Airport. And it's always really exciting, I think, to see the thread of the weavings or just each individual pick kind of blown up in such a massive scale. And I've also shown some of my work in like broken up. So this is the first animation that I showed, and you can see how it's kind of encased within this box that had 3 monitors behind it. And the motion at times kind of goes across all 3 monitors. But okay, I wanted to end by talking about my current project, which I have been working on for the past 2 years, off and on. And this is much different from a lot of my other work. I am creating an animated short that I think will probably be around 5 to 7 minutes long. And unlike a lot of my other work, which has been shown in gallery settings, I'm really hoping to complete a story and to submit this to different film festivals. And so this story is called Whose Woods Are These? And it's based on the true story of my great-great-great-great-grandmother who disappeared in 1841. She left her home to gather hickory nuts and she never returned. And so there have been some historical crime maps and genealogical records and interviews that I've been able to kind of dig through over the years. But this is an image of or a historical map showing where she was last seen. And I superimposed it with a Google satellite image and kind of zoomed in. And so it's kind of interesting now, this area in Northwest Ohio is just flattened by commercial agriculture, but back in the 1800s, the Erie Canal had not been channeled, so it was just a much different landscape. And that's kind of part of the interest to imagining this rural area where I come from, how it used to be so wild, and now it's much different. But here are some, images of European settlers coming in and clearing the land. And then my dad actually made a short documentary about this area used to be called the Black Swamp. And so the top left image is a scene or a footage from his documentary. And then this is an interview with my great-great-grandfather, who was with her the day she disappeared. But my intention is not to tell like the true story of this. It's more so built on this idea of, using textiles as a way to pass on family stories and to also kind of use this as a jumping off point to make up my own fictional story, which is pretty simple. It depicts a woman who basically leaves her home and finds wonder in the woods and ends up living in the woods. So I am weaving with the industrial loom at my college, which has enabled me to weave tons of fabrics. So this is just a small sampling of what I have woven so far. I've probably woven hundreds of feet. And I'm also working with this industrial software called EAT to make this, to work with the loom. And these are just 2 screenshots of the software. On the right shows you how you can build weave structures. And so it has this like very sophisticated 3D modeling that kind of makes multi-layered structures just make a bit more sense. So I've been able to kind of get a little bit more complicated and think about weaving in a more complex way and experiment with integrating different colors and layers. And then another neat thing about this program is there's a simulation tool. So on the left is a simulation of the weaving, which really reduces waste and allows you to kind of see what you're weaving and work out anything before you send it to the loom. But I thought I would just play a few sequences from the story. I have a number of rough cuts that I'm working with. I finally hired an editor who's helping me work through some things. So these are just a few short excerpts. And I should mention too that the sound is a mess. It's all over the place. And we are kind of just plopping in different music that I have no rights to at all. So none of this music is my own, and I won't use it in the final film. But know from my end, the sound is kind of going in and out. It's not a big deal, but anyway, so this is kind of how the story starts out, and then she walks to the forest. And then she arrives and has this, not sure what's happening with this sound. So she has this sort of sign that she should enter the woods. And that's where I'm at with the story now. And so this is the really fun part to be in, because I'm working now with tons of color, and I'm trying to sort of capture this like awe and wonder in the forest. And so I wanted to point out the bottom left image where you can kind of see the grass is turning green. I used the same method that I described earlier with double weave, where the green and the yellow thread is sort of, that layer is slowly surfacing to the top. And then, for some reason, when I go to the next slide, I may have to stop and then open it again. For some reason, this one video never. So I wanted to show some behind the scenes images, because something that is different with this project is I'm shooting all the footage myself. And many of the scenes I'm just capturing with my iPhone when I'm on hikes with my family. And so I have a lot of these ridiculous moments where, like in this one, my husband was like beeping at me from the car.
Is it on?
Yes.
That's okay, I can edit it.
James Nartker's calling.
My tween daughter is just so annoyed and does not want to follow me around the woods anymore.
Come on, hold on. I'm taking a video.
I don't know if you can hear, but my son is saying, "We're gonna be attacked." You know what? Because I'm picking someone's berries. But I bring this up because a lot of the footage is far from perfect, and I need to doctor it up after I render out the JPEGs. And so in many of the scenes, I'm isolating the figure and then superimposing the figure onto other scenes and kind of stitching together things in this different way. And so this is the video, I think, that may not play. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna just close it, sorry, and then I'll reopen it real quick. Hold on. Okay, let's see. This happened to me before, I'm not sure why, but okay. So you can see there's the figure removed from the original shot and then kind of walking into this historical painting. But I think it's kind of, I noticed this with some of my students too, that I think those of us who work with textiles, when we start to work in like other digital programs, at least I have found in myself, there's sort of this like physical, intuitive way of working. Like a lot of my files are just a mess, but I think I work with these digital processes very similar to the way I would work with like fabric and kind of figuring things out as I go. And so I wanted to end with one final scene. So throughout this project, I'm also there's a number of sort of nods to different textile histories. This is a silk weaving from the 18th century weaver, Anna Maria Garthwaite, who was one of the few women textile designers at that time, and many of her designs are sort of known for bringing on this renewed interest in botanical landscapes. And so in this scene, you can kind of see how I have integrated it in. And that is all. Let me stop sharing. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what was happening with my sound a few of this sequences. I think my PowerPoints are just so massive. I have some huge files on there. So the whole PowerPoint itself is like 5 GB, and I run into issues. So sorry about that.
I think we got a great sense of it. That was
Unbelievable. So I see a question here for you, Kate, from Annie, who's in our class.
Great.
What do you feel is the future of tapestries in cinema? Do you feel it will change with the uprising usage of AI and 3D applications? And if so, how?
That is a good question. I think so. I mean, on Instagram, I see so many new younger artists. There's one that's working in the MIT lab that's doing all of this animation with weaving or with knitting. And I think there are so many new tools that are being developed, but there's also such a history that I don't know. I have no, AI is like not my expertise. I have no idea, but I am sure it will impact everything. But I know I have also noticed like a lot of new exhibitions that are kind of building on this history of textiles and cinema. Like there's the Len Lai Center in New Zealand. Len Lai was this abstract avant-garde filmmaker who had a studio next to a batik studio, and so a lot of his like abstract films are informed by batik. And so there's a huge exhibition coming up that has pulled together all of these artists that work with tapestries and animation. And so I don't know, I think there's a lot to still build on in terms of the history that we already have. And it's exciting to think about the digital tools. I also know there are some examples of animators and designers that are creating different films with simulations, like the one I showed. So I think that's probably something that we will see too. I don't know.
I guess
So
the second part of that question is, do you feel there will be a collision of the interactive digital medium being incorporated through textiles? I guess that's what
Oh, I bet. I haven't thought of that, but I'm sure. Have you all seen any examples of that? I'm just curious. Because yes, yeah. Cool. Do you know the name of the artist, or I'm just curious. This is not an area. Yeah, go
So,
ahead.
mine was more of I've seen digital watermarking being embedded into art that's being put onto shirts and whatnot, and also having those digital watermarks being woven into the fabrics themselves. So when people scan the shirts or pieces of clothing, then it'll bring them to whatever website the person wants them to. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of where I was.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much, I'm sure, that we will see. It's funny. And I know that of course the TC2, I didn't even talk about it, but I mean everybody knows the connection to the zeros and ones and the computer. And I mean there's so many artists kind of, mining that territory. For some reason, I always just go back to the past and really focus on filmmaking, but I know there's so much that can be said about digital media and textiles as well.
I'm curious. Are you working with double weave? I see like in your honeycomb weaves, you've got these like very fine little white threads that are like coming forward and then all of a sudden they're disappeared. Are you double
Oh,
quilting that?
which one was that? Was that in the
Well, like your
pattern one?
honeycomb eyes, for example, or
Oh,
you were
yeah.
showing a film just now and it had like the horizon line was green and then in the back, then you had the sort of the sky area. It seemed to be very, very fragile. Yeah, different weight.
Yeah, I am working with a lot of double weave, especially on the industrial loom. But the honeycomb, I didn't talk about that, but it might be interesting in the context of a TC2 class. I feel like for years I just worked with single shaded satins forever. And now as an instructor, I'm always trying to push students beyond that. But I think for 10 years, I probably only worked with single shaded satins. I think I was just thinking about other things or the animation itself. But then at some point had a turning point where I realized like I can work with traditional patterns and traditional structures and just manipulate them. And so I don't know if you all have Dobby looms or whatever, but like we have this like very simple weave point program where it's like grid paper. And so I've started to take screenshots of traditional weaving patterns, bringing them into Photoshop. So that eyeball weave struck honeycomb was just a traditional honeycomb structure. And instead of having all black warp floats, I in Photoshop inserted a photo representational image of an eye. And so I think there's a lot to explore there with like in trying to think of, because it's so easy. It's like it's hard to not want to weave a photograph or to translate an image on the loom because it does it so well. But I think it was helpful for me to just kind of go back to traditional structures and think about ways to like manipulate them by either bringing in imagery or like stretching them out or changing the shape somehow.
Right. And so are you working with an industrial loom also where you are?
Yeah, just for that one project.
Could you explain what that is? Because I don't know that the students necessarily understand the difference between the TC2 and the industrial.
Yeah, so the industrial, you don't physically weave it at all. It's you create the file and then there's a weaving technician at our school that like oversees the loom. But as same with the TC2, so much of the work goes into creating the structures and creating the files ahead of time. And so we use that EAT software, which is, has for me, a lot of things clicked because prior to using this, I had only built structures in Photoshop with black and white pixels. And it gets so abstract and it's really hard especially when you're working with multi-layered cloth to like really get a sense of what is happening and like what that structure looks like. And I think the EAT software is really nice because it has this like, you can like move the structure around and see it in a 3D space and really understand how the layers are interacting. And so since I started using that software for this project, I have managed to like create much more complex structures and like 2 or 3 layer structures, and which gives you so many more colors when you're weaving. So and we have a black and white warp on the industrial loom too. So you can get a lot of shades and tints and stuff. But it doesn't ever compare to like hand woven fabric. To me, it looks very flat. And I really only like using it for like longer animated shorts, nothing like,
Yes, I'd love to hear you say just a little bit more about that because I think, right now we're in the middle of, as I said, rolling on this. It's very labor intensive, very hands-on. It's very like bodily embedded. I mean, it's incredibly dense. And so to hear you say something about the difference between having your hand in the project versus the industrial loom might be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the goal of this project, which is really to create a story, to create a film, like I feasibly could not, I don't think I could do that with the TC2. It would take too long. So I have come around to accept the use of the industrial loom. And there are, in terms of the process, there's things I really love about it. Like I love working in that EAT software and playing around with the simulation tool, but the material itself just is not precious to me. I have like stacks of the fabric in my corner of my room under my bed. Whereas I think if it's something that I wove, I treat it, it's precious, it's something I've invested time in. And it also just looks so much better. I think any of my animations, I really feel like the strongest ones are the ones that you can really see the hand in. And it's really hard to get that look with industrial looms. I know like Dorothy Leaves would trick the industrial looms and make them skip sometimes to bring in that hand quality and stuff. But I haven't, yeah. So I've come around, I'm happy with it for this project, but it's not my thing, I guess.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, so let's see some more questions coming up. Let's see, stop motion embroidery animator here, completing a master's project at PNCA. on using handcraft to make animation more accessible, non-hierarchical, social, collaborative.
No way.
I was wondering if and how collaboration plays a part in your practice as another lineage of textile work.
So I usually do not collaborate. I don't know. I just started to collaborate on this project because it was just too much. And so I'm working with an editor, and it's the first time really that I have really collaborated this much. And I was kind of scared of it. I don't know if it's because I felt like this control over the project, or I have a hard time confronting people or something. I don't know. I think all these tricky interpersonal things that come up with collaboration, I tend to avoid. But this has been awesome, like working with an editor and getting his insights, and having him bring different ideas to the project. I've really been enjoying it. And so I can imagine collaboration happening more, but it's a good point. I mean, it is and I think, with other textile processes and like activities, like I'm more open to collaborating, but I think with like an animation, it's something that I've just kind of held off on. But it's true, it's such an important part of the history of textile crafts. But that's so neat. Who's embroidering animation. Yeah, that's awesome.
Charlie Wilcox. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Great.
Let's see. Another student is asking, first, I am floored by your work, Kate. I have a question regarding one of your gallery exhibits you shared that was based on touch. Was this an interactive exhibition where viewers could touch the work?
No, it wasn't. It was really more informed by this idea of like haptic visuality, of like the eye operating as an organ of touch, I guess. But yeah, it was not you couldn't touch things. But there were a lot of different videos set up that had like that sort of summoned this idea of like a haptic or embodied viewership, I guess. That was like the idea. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
I have a quick question, Kate.
Yeah.
First off, I want to say like that was an amazing presentation. Like hands down, probably one of the best presentations I've ever seen. And like you show so much mastery in your work when it comes to both animation and when it comes to like conceptualizing your ideas with your weaving projects. But I'm
Thank you.
curious to know like what were some like learning points for you when you first started working with the TC2 loom? Because this is like my second year working with the loom, and like I'm constantly like learning new things, like oh, like the thickness of the fabric that I'm shooting through it like could potentially distort my image. Or like if I'm
Yeah.
doing like multicolor weave project, like I have to be pretty mindful of the file setup, or like the machine could get confused. But I guess like if you could give some advice to like students who are just getting used to the loom, like what would you have to say
Gosh,
to
that is
like
such a good question.
yeah.
I mean, like I said, I truly took such baby steps for a decade. I was just, I didn't really push structure experimentation for a long time. It really was single shaded satins. But, and so a big turning point for me, I think, was what I was saying with like using the traditional structures and just trying to manipulate those in different ways. And then another thing, my friend Johanna Friedman, who has a TC2, you should have her in this lecture series. She's wonderful. But she taught me how to build structures in, like I always have worked in black and white pixels, but she starts with, when she's building structures, she has a white warp. So she starts with a white block of pixels, and then she works with the color of her actual yarn. And so she designs these structures in the colors that she's going to actually be working with. And that was a really helpful thing for me, because there's such an abstract leap between the flat black and white pixels to like what you're going to weave. So I think if you can kind of condense it and work in the actual colors of your loom, like whatever your warp is and whatever colors you plan to weave on. And then as a last step, turn those, turn the white into black. So it's the warp, turn the color into white. So it's the weft. But that was huge. And then also just following these like handouts, like I had, I taught a TC2 workshop in last semester in Sweden, and a lot of students wanted to work with double weave, and it was something that I had not really done that much of at that point. And so I found a bunch of these handouts from other instructors, and then Catherine Amade has some wonderful handouts too. And I think just going through the process, because the thing about the TC2 is that you're standing there and you're so close and you can see the structures develop. And so I think there's like this clicking that happens that does not happen on an industrial loom when you don't get to see it that close up. So I think just even if you don't have like an idea in mind, but just sampling out and going through the steps of different handouts, like whether it's how to build a double weave structure, that's always helpful. And then like applying that technique to an idea later on. So like giving yourself time to like sample and just try things out without a set project in mind is always good.
Well, that makes me want to follow up on Omar's questions, because as Omar said, Omar has taken the class twice, but we only offer the class for a term each year. So it's far and few in between that you can jump back on the loom. My question to you, Kate, is how often were you able to have access to the loom during that decade where you were trying to learn it?
Off and on. I mean, that's a huge problem, I think, with the loom being so expensive, is that if you get really into it and then you graduate and you leave the institution, you're just sort of suspended in air. So I actually use, I don't know if you all know, Wovens, WOVNS. They have access to an industrial jacquard loom, but I don't think I showed any of the work that I made with them. But if you really want to continue working with jacquard weaving, you don't actually build the structures, but the quality of their weavings are beautiful and they're not that expensive. So I worked with Wovens for a little while until I got access. But thankfully there's more, I think, spaces opening up, like Praxis in Cleveland. We're trying to start, I'm hoping that we can start some kind of residency at my work to allow people to come use our loom too. But it's so depressing how expensive the looms are, and how if you like build your art practice centered on a piece of equipment that you don't own, it's really a challenge to figure out how to move on from that.
And there are a few artists that are going around to Iceland and to Praxis and to make their work, which is nuts. But yeah, that's nuts.
I mean, it's always good. I think scarcity in technology materials always leads to breakthroughs too. I think those times that I didn't have access, I worked in new ways that I probably wouldn't have, but it's such a lovely machine. It's hard to live without.
Can you give any advice to the students right now about the rolling on process and the tying process, and like what keeps you like engaged while you're getting through that? We're just about ready to finish the rolling on, which has taken a couple of weeks, and then the tying begins, and then we got to weave again, but it's
well, for me, I think talking about collaboration, like working with one another in the studio and working with pairs or small groups together to set up the loom makes it much more manageable. And yeah, I know, I think I mentioned this to Annan when we met, but in Sweden, they have this, of course, this social democratic society that shapes everything in their lives. But the way that they ran the loom in that school was incredible. Like each student set up their own warp. So every time a student took on the loom, they tied on a new warp, and the previous student would help that student. So they all worked together, and it was this like really graceful train of one student using the loom for a few weeks and then next. And they all would take, there was this really organized schedule, and they helped tie on, they helped wind on. And so no one was ever doing the setup alone, even though it was their own warp. it was really amazing to see that. And it was pretty graceful. And I think, yeah, in the end, it's the time that you do spend setting up can kind of be fun, a bonding experience, I don't know, but it is just so much labor. It's hard.
I was curious, you mentioned briefly that your dad had taken some early, and maybe that was an influence on you, but did you begin as a filmmaker animator or as a weaver first?
I was definitely a weaver first, I think. I mean, my dad was a photo, I mean, I guess like a photojournalist to some degree, like for very small newspapers. And so when I started animating in grad school, I was given this massive box of 8mm film reels and VHS tapes that I digitized. And so that was a lot of what I worked with throughout grad school. And I think my written thesis was kind of about much more focused on memory and family archives and stuff like that. And so, we had a dark room growing up. And so I remember taking black and white pictures and developing them in the basement with my dad. And I think even though I dabbled in photography and film stuff, it was always like real tactile, like the act of seeing a image surface on the paper in the bath. And I was in 4-H. I don't know if you all know what that is. Like in the rural areas, I always focused on photography. So I guess I did have some background, but I would say throughout my life, it's always been textiles predominantly. Yeah.
Well, does anybody else have any questions for Kate while we have her? It was just your work is remarkable, Kate.
Oh, thank you so
I'm
much.
so much in gratitude that you joined us and super interesting. I know I'm going to be hearing about this for a while. That's great.
Thank you for all the
Thank you so much.
references. The references
Oh,
you
good.
shared are invaluable. I'm going to be chasing all
Oh,
of those
good.
down. So this is a really great record. This talk will be part of our events archive too, so we can revisit
Awesome.
it through that link on the PSU Textile Arts site.
Great. I will
Oh,
definitely not watch it. I hate how it is here in New
No, it was great. You'll want to revisit it.
we
One
have
more question here. Annie says, what type of thread do you typically like to work with? Content,
Well,
thread fiber content.
yeah, I mean, for years it's always been mercerized cotton, but now I am so excited to work with fuzzy, fuzzy stuff. So I think as soon as I finish this bigger project, which is kind of my summer goal, I'm really looking forward to working with like mohairs and merino wools and just like thick, fuzzy stuff and brushing it out more and doing more like textural effects. But really, it's almost always been mercerized cotton. I love the is it the 3-2? It's really chunky. Yeah.
So Omar, I think you're talking about like when your image stretches. Omar's been struggling with like nothing too thick, but you can, once you do a little test on the loom and you see that it's stretching, then you can adjust your file so that you can, it's called aspect ratio, right? So you can squash the image or expand the image so that when you weave with that particular chunkier stuff, it'll weave according to what you want.
And on the TC2, I almost always just do it. I guess I like squish my image down almost 60% because I always work with chunkier stuff and then I know it's gonna grow when I weave it.
Do you find, I find that when I weave with just, like you say, the satins, the ombre satins with one, then I don't need to. But when I'm doing multiple colors with the shuttles, I always either have to expand or reduce depending. Yeah.
Yeah.
You just kind of get to know, I think.
Yeah, I think you get to know it. And we have a really thin warp. We have 22s. And so I never weave with anything that thin. And so I always have to, I've never had to stretch out my image. I always have to scrunch it down because it's in the weaving is always stretched out.
And that's what we're using, the 22, Omar. Just
Are
so
you too? Yeah. Yeah, it's thin. So I've always had to just squish it down, but it's it can be, those technical things can be frustrating to work through too. I know.
fine. Oh, here's another question from Sierra. Did you create any animations on an analog loom before you had access to the digital looms?
No, but when I was in Sweden, I did make an animation on a counter march loom, and that was really fun. And so I I've been thinking about different pattern animations that I want to work on with the Dobby loom. I teach a Dobby weaving class at NC State, and I don't feel that confident in it, so I thought it would be kind of a good opportunity for me to improve my own Dobby weaving skills and also make an animation.
So the Dobby loom folks who have taken analog weaving, there's some of us that have, some of us haven't. Is that kind of a little computer loom, that little one that's in the back of the studio, the analog studio, that operates on a program, WeavePoint, but you have to do a repeat. You can't just have, you have to have a repeat. It only,
Yeah. And I mean, it's all manual. Really, the only thing that's computerized, I guess, is you don't have to crawl under the loom to do a tie up and you don't have to think about the different petals when you're actually weaving.
Oh, Annie, you can ask as many as you want. I promise this is my last question, says Annie. Do you do a lot of manipulations with your pieces after you weave them? Brushing, loosening the weave, stretching, coloring, etc.
With the new wool work, that I'm brushing a lot of it out, of course. And then with this other project that I'm working on, I've been painting on the surface. And I think I meant to bring that up earlier. Like, one of the things about weaving on this industrial loom and the fabric not being that precious is I don't care. Like, I'm much more like willing to paint and splatter and do different things on the fabric that I probably would be a little more hesitant or careful about if I had woven it on the TC2. But many of the scenes in the beginning part of that project are hand painted on the surface. But I guess that's really the only post-production work I've done is brushing out the wool and painting. And sometimes I've played around with like splattering with discharge paste and stuff. But I certainly, I mean, that's a great idea. There's so much work out there where weavers are doing stuff after the loom, and it's inspiring.
Very exciting. We could have you here all night, but it's probably like 10 or 11 your time,
it's
right?
Super late your time too.
Oh, it's fine. Not really.
Okay, I think maybe that's
sounds great. Well, like I said before, we do have this in recording, so we will have access to a lot of these ideas on the archive on psutextilearts.com. So thank you so much, Kate. This has just been mind expanding, fabulous. So,
oh, you're all so sweet. Thank you so much.
Jealous of everybody in class. Now you get to be inspired by this in your work.
Great.
Thank you very much. And
yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you,
Bye.
Kate.